Behind every report card, every graduation requirement, and even every single lesson plan, there's this huge kind of invisible system of standards and tests. But how does this thing actually work? And more importantly, is it really measuring what matters? Let's dive in and unpack the whole machinery of how we measure learning.
And this is really the big question, isn't it? How do you actually measure something as complex as knowledge or a new skill? It's not a simple problem at all, and the way we try to answer it, well, that shapes everything from a single classroom lesson all the way up to national education policy.
So, to really get a handle on the whole system, let's start small. Let's zoom way in and focus on a specific group of students. Just imagine for a second someone who's learning a new language. Before you can help them, you need a goal, right? A clear target. You need a blueprint for what success even looks like.
That blueprint? That's what we call standards. In our example, we're talking about ELD, or English Language Development Standards. And this isn't just some list of vocabulary words. No, it's a really detailed roadmap that breaks down what it means to be proficient into specific skills. Without it, teachers are kind of just guessing what to focus on. But with it, they have a clear, consistent guide for their teaching.
But, of course, a roadmap is only useful if you know where you are on it. And that's where assessment comes in. An ELD assessment is basically like a GPS. It checks a student's progress in all the key areas: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And the results don't just give you a grade, they give you a diagnosis. They tell a teacher, hey, this student is awesome at reading, but they're really struggling with speaking. And that's information you can actually use.
So, it really just boils down to this two-step process. First, you define the destination with standards. Then, you check your location with an assessment. This simple-sounding cycle is the engine for the entire system, driving everything from how a curriculum is designed to how we hold schools accountable.
Okay, so now let's zoom out a bit. How does this model scale up from just one student to this much broader system? Because this whole idea of standards and assessment, it's not just for kids in a classroom. It goes all the way into adult education and into the modern workplace.
For adults, the goals get a little more diverse, and so do the standards. So you have systems like CASAs, which focus on those foundational academic skills, the bedrock of learning. But then you have frameworks like SCANS, which totally shift the focus to workplace skills, the so-called soft skills like teamwork and problem solving that are absolutely crucial for a career. It really shows how standards adapt to measure whatever society values at different stages of our lives.
And this brings us to a pretty logical question, right? If we have these detailed expectations for every type of learner out there, doesn't it make sense to have some clear expectations for the people who are actually doing the teaching?
And yep, of course, the system includes them. Teacher standards define what an effective educator should know and be able to do. The whole goal here is consistency and quality. These standards become the blueprint for how we train, develop, and even evaluate our teachers, all in an effort to make sure that a student in one classroom is getting just as good of an education as a student in another.
So far, this all sounds pretty logical, doesn't it? You set some goals, you measure the progress. Simple. But this is where our story takes a pretty big turn. Because when the stakes get really high, the very act of measuring can start to change the thing you're trying to measure.
And that's the central paradox here. A system that was designed to ensure learning can, kind of ironically, end up distorting it. And the consequences aren't minor, they can be huge, affecting the experience for both students and teachers in a big way.
This whole thing creates a massive ripple effect. When test scores get tied to high-stakes stuff like school funding or teacher pay, the pressure just skyrockets. All of a sudden, the curriculum often narrows down, schools spend way more time on the tested subjects like math and reading, while things like art, music, or even just recess get pushed to the side. And this, inevitably, leads to teaching to the test, where the goal shifts from real, deep critical thinking to just getting the highest score possible on one exam. This whole phenomenon is what's known as test-driven teaching. It's really the educational version of the tail wagging the dog. The test stops being a tool to measure learning, and instead, it becomes the curriculum itself. So instead of exploring big ideas, the focus can shrink down to just mastering multiple choice strategies and specific question formats.
So, this leads us to the final and maybe the most important part of our whole explainer. If these tests have so much power, we have to ask a really crucial question. Are they even fair? This is where we get into the concept of test bias. The best way to think about it is like a broken scale. If the scale is off, it doesn't matter what you put on it. The measurement is always going to be wrong.
Well, in the same way, if a test has bias, it's no longer measuring a student's knowledge. Instead, it's measuring how well they fit the specific mold the test was built for, which can totally undermine the whole process and just reinforce the inequalities that are already there.
And you can see just how subtle this can be. For example, a math problem might be wrapped up in a story about yachting or playing polo. A student from a low-income background might get stuck not because of the math, but because the whole context is completely unfamiliar. Same goes for cultural references or complex language. If the test is using fancy vocabulary that isn't even central to what's being tested, it can unfairly knock down a non-native English speaker. In every single case, the test ends up measuring a student's background, not their ability.
This forces us to look way deeper, which is exactly what the field of critical language testing is all about. It goes beyond just looking at test scores and starts asking some tough ethical questions. Like, what is the real-world impact of this test on people's lives? Is it actually a tool for opportunity, or has it become a gatekeeper that just reinforces the divides we already have in society?
And that leaves us with this final, critical question to think about. The entire purpose of all this testing is supposed to be about supporting learning and creating opportunities. But we have to constantly ask ourselves if our methods are actually doing that, or if the very tools we're using to measure progress have become the biggest obstacles in the way.